everyone, it's Clarice, and it's also nearing the end of 2016. At the beginning of this year, I set for myself a bunch of reading goals, and one of those reading goals was to read more nonfiction. So today I'm going to talk to you about how I did with that reading goal. But before I get to that, just letting you know that I'm actually making videos like these for every single one of the reading goals that I set this year. So I'll leave the links to all the other videos that are out so far in the description below in case you're interested in seeing those. So going back to the nonfiction books, the goal I set for myself was to read more nonfiction than I did last year. And last year, I read only 5, so all I had to do was beat that. This year, I was actually able to read 10 nonfiction books. And those books are the following: Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, The Japanese Art of Decluttering and Organizing by Marie Kondo, The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage, The Mostly True Story of the First Computer by Sidney Padua, Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, Persepolis 1, The Story of a Childhood by Marjane Satrapi, Persepolis 2, The Story of a Return, also by Marjane Satrapi, The Fifth Beetle, The Brian Epstein Story by Vivek J. Tiwari, The Complete Mouse by Art Spiegelman, Fun Home, a Family Tragicomic by Alison Bechdel, and Inside Out, Get Ideas Out of Your Head and Into the World by Tina Seelig. Maybe the count could change a bit because Persepolis is actually sold as one book sometimes, and I could have counted that as the complete Persepolis. And Mouse is also sold as 2 books sometimes, and I could have counted that as 2 different books. But I'm just basing this on the formats and editions that I read them in, so let's just leave it at 10 nonfiction books. Either way, I reached my goal, so it doesn't really matter. So those are all the nonfiction books that I read this year, and honestly, quite a few of them really surprised me. Because I'm mainly a fiction reader, and even though I was definitely interested in reading a lot of these books that I read, I didn't really expect to fall in love with any of them. But in the end, 3 out of these 10 books actually ended up becoming new favorites of mine. Namely, Quiet, The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage, and Mouse. All 3 of these I enjoyed so much. It's ridiculous. Another thing worth noting, I think, is that a lot of the books that I read were actually graphic nonfiction. I love comics, so this isn't really a surprise, but it's just nice to know that there's so much nice graphic nonfiction books out there. So 6 out of 10 of the nonfiction books that I read were actually comics. And those 6 books were The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage, Persepolis 1, Persepolis 2, The Fifth Beetle, Mouse, as well as Fun Home. And I think it's nice that I was able to have that because nonfiction, for me at least, comes off as a bit intimidating. If any of you are having that problem, there's so many nice comics that are nonfiction that you can read. Another thing to note is that, as I mentioned, I am mostly a fiction reader, but there are many times that I think nonfiction with a similar story would give a greater impact than a fiction book would. Because when I read fiction and something seems unrealistic, it takes me out of the story. But when I read nonfiction and something seems unrealistic, it actually pulls me in even more. Because there were certain things that I read that seemed so tragic or so amazing that the idea that they're real is just wow. Overall, I'm still definitely going to read more fiction than nonfiction, but I'm definitely not going to be as quick to assume that nonfiction is more boring or more intimidating, because some of the most interesting books I read this year were nonfiction, and I'm sure I'm going to read so much more interesting nonfiction in the future. So how much nonfiction do you read normally, at least compared to the fiction books that you read? And do you have any nonfiction books to recommend to me? What's the most interesting one that you've read recently? Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.